All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Susan Reynolds. I'm with Friends for Survival, and we are very excited to have Liseanne with us this evening. I'd like to read you a little bio of her before Marilyn and she get into this wonderful conversation. We'll be here for 1 hour. So Liseanne is the director of suicide prevention at WellSpace Health, a nationally accredited suicide prevention program. Liseanne started as a crisis line volunteer 2 years after the loss of her oldest brother to suicide, and advanced in her career and studies over her tenure at the Crisis Center, and where she's currently serving as director. Liseanne has dedicated the last 17 years to suicide prevention and crisis intervention through the Crisis Center at WellSpace Health, as well as several years in child abuse prevention in educational settings. The Suicide Prevention Crisis Center is responsible for primary and backup coverage throughout much of California and also hosts several local and regional hotlines. Liseanne is a member of the American Association of Suicidology, the National Association of Crisis Organization Directors, and the American Association for Christian Counselors. She also holds a master's degree in Christian counseling and Doctorate of Divinity. So through her work at WellSpace Health, Liseanne created an innovative ED follow-up pilot program in 2010, as well as creating and implementing the first known primary care suicide prevention follow-up program for suicidal patients in primary care. She also served as content expert in creating a statewide, what's called POST, which is Peace Officers Standard Training for law enforcement and dispatchers in California. Liseanne also maintains a private integrative Christian counseling practice and has a passion for nurturing wellness, mind, body, and spirit. So welcome, Liseanne. We are excited to have you here this evening. I'm going to go ahead and turn it all over to Marilyn, and I will be over in the corner answering questions. So please post your questions as we go, and I will get those all ready to go, and we can answer them as we go or toward the end. So thank you very much. Go ahead, Marilyn.
Hey, thank you. Thank you, Susan. You're so good with the technology. We couldn't do this without you.
Exactly.
You know, Liseanne and I have known each other for quite a few years because of just what she does, and we've been on some committees and together. We have also kind of followed one another on this on speaking panels, and just have got to be friends long time. She would be our speaker for our webinar. And I have heard you mention that your oldest brother died by suicide. But I've never really heard you talk about any particulars about that or how it affected you, your family, and what was your grief journey like? So could you share that with us today?
I will. And first of all, just thanks, Marilyn, for having me here. It's really, it's my privilege to talk with you all and to be able to have this opportunity. And thanks, Susan, for the great introduction. I did lose my brother, my oldest brother. I'm the middle of 5 kids. I'm the middle child. And I lost my brother, I think over about 20 years ago. I'm not a great historian on, I don't track as well. But it's been about 20 years. He ended his life, and I was a current student at Sac State at the time. I was working on my undergraduate in psychology. He had shot himself. And a month before that, he came out. He lived out of state, and I think he was living in Colorado at the time. And we had just gone out maybe a month or two before. And it was he got remarried. He had been divorced for a long while, and he had gotten remarried, and we all traveled to his new home in a different state, and they got married, and then his new wife got pregnant, so they had a baby on the way, and they had 4 children between them, 2 of their own children from previous relationships and marriages. And so I share all that, the background, because the only thing that stuck with me, I remember when I first found out, we had never talked about suicide in my family. It just wasn't on our radar. It really wasn't on our radar. I knew what the word meant. I studied it in college. But as far as personal experience, it wasn't even something that we talked about. And we talked about a lot of emotional things, but we just never talked about suicide as a family. And I grew up Catholic. And so, a lot of Catholic churches, especially 20 years ago, had a very conservative stance on suicide. And so that was maybe more taboo, more stigma around suicide, why we wouldn't talk about it. And we never really knew anybody who was suicidal or who had died by suicide, at least that we knew of, right, at that time. I remember getting the phone call, and I still to this day, I can clear as a bell remember exactly where I was in the house when I got the call. I fell to my knees. I cussed, and I'm not a cussing girl, but I cussed like a sailor, and just said, my family is really blanked up. Like, what? I can't believe this. And I was just in shock and horror, as I'm sure many of you were as well. And it literally sucked the wind out of me. And I don't know how I got off the floor that night. I don't remember that, but I just remember the shock and horror and disbelief that I was hearing. And when my younger brother called me to tell me the news, and he had written a letter, and I don't remember if we knew about that. Yeah, I think we knew about that originally, but he had written a letter and was saying goodbye, and that at 50, he just felt like it was all downhill. And then it was a Friday, and he was supposed to go to work that day, and he instead was in his blue jeans, and he left the house, and there was, I guess the letter was on the table somewhere. And then he went up to the mountains, which he loves. He was an outdoorsman and a fisherman. He loved to fly fish and hunt and hike and all those things. And he left in his blue jeans, and that was his last day. And he called 911 right before he shot himself. And I don't know what happened with that phone call, and I don't have an interest in hearing it or learning more about that. But that's the only thing that I do know about that. And what I remember next was just how the fallout happened and how it was so different than any other death we had experienced. And I was still pretty, I'm 60, so I was 40-ish back then. And we still hadn't experienced a ton of death in our family. We were pretty sheltered as far as death went, other than maybe distant relatives. And so grief in general was really hard for me. But, add to that the whole stigma and shame around suicide just really made it unbearable. For myself, I called a counselor the next day. I knew I just couldn't handle it. And it was beyond my own coping capabilities. And that helped me a lot. And I remember shortly after us all walking around the block, my parents' house, and my mom was just lost. That was her firstborn son, and she was just lost after that. And honestly, I don't think she really ever fully recovered completely. She still had such a broken heart whenever we talked about Steve. And I think it's probably only a mom, could understand. I can't imagine any of my children, being gone. So I really could appreciate just how hard that was for her. But on top of that, there were complications with the funeral. There was complications about we were grieving. They were really mad at him. I'm like, well, why are you guys so mad at Steve? I felt really brokenhearted and sad. And for the most part, that's what I felt all along, was shock, and then, disbelief, and, all those stages you go through. I didn't hit anger for probably 2 years. It was 2 years, I think, out. And maybe that's because the depression lifted after right around a year and a half or 2 years. But I just remember thinking, why is everybody so angry? But then later I got it. I really got it. I got what they were angry about, and they were hurt. It was just pain behind all that hurt, and behind all the anger. And grieving was even more complicated because at that time, it was really uncomfortable with the church and burial and funerals. And there was, a lot of complication with that. My mom, with her own discomfort around suicide, and even acknowledging that is how my brother died. It was hard for her to even tell her really close friends and family, people that she had. My mom was passed since then, but people she had known her whole life, who reared all their kids together and stuff. She still felt a lot of shame about even acknowledging that he had killed himself. And we had to, be quiet for a while and not share it until she was ready to, talk openly about it. We ended up having a funeral in my other older brother's backyard. And I remember thinking, sitting there with my family thinking, and we have a pretty big family, but I was really sad that we didn't get to really honor my brother's life, for who he was and for all that he was, and because of the way that he died. And that sat with me for a while. Like, I played a song on my guitar and it kind of made it more personal. And the priest that had been with our family all along, he still stuck with us and led the ceremony at home in my other brother's backyard. But it was really hard. It caused a lot of division with his wife, his new wife, and like she was really angry, and everybody was pointing fingers, and nobody had answers. Nobody had warning signs except in hindsight. And we know in hindsight, you think you have 20/20 vision. And my 20/20 vision, was he had come out a month before he took his life, and when he came out, he wanted to go boating at Folsom Lake. He wanted all of us to be there, all of his siblings to be there. And that was really unusual for him. Like he was social with his, immediate family, but him to call all of us and want to go boating just randomly out of nowhere was really unusual. And at that time I couldn't go. And I really couldn't go. It was like work related thing. And my other siblings went, and I didn't feel bad at the time, but after he took his life, I did. I had a lot of, sadness that was my last opportunity to see my brother. And for him, that was his goodbye. I have no question at all. He came out knowing that he was going to end his life. And they all had a great time. They fished, they took some great pictures. And after he passed, and after we got his ashes, we went back out in the same boat on the same lake in the same spot. We, spread his ashes out there. I'm pretty sure you're not supposed to do that, but that was our way of remembering him and honoring him and celebrating his life. But it was a really long journey. And I remember also in my early grief thinking, how does this even happen? Where do you turn? I had a counselor that worked at my church. She volunteered her time. And so I was lucky and blessed in that way, that I had immediate support and that it really was, meaningful to me and available and accessible right in the moment. But that's not the case for everybody. And anyway, I just remember it being really a struggle for a while. And then things got a little bit easier as time went on, and I got more integrated back into my everyday life, and depression wasn't so overwhelming, but I was really depressed for about a year. And then I was trying to think what else. We had other losses at the same time, and I've lost several family members, so I'm well acquainted with grief now. That whole it never happens to us thing is long gone. But Steve's by far was the worst loss because of the shock, the nature of it, because of all the stigma that was around it and still is. And my heart just aches for people who, lose somebody to suicide, because it's really a difficult loss to get over. And I don't think that ever entirely happens. I remember several years ago, at least 8 years ago, I was helping AFSP at the time. I don't do that any longer, but I was a speaker at the end for a couple of years. I did like a blessing at the end, and shared a little bit about my brother and kind of a charge about suicide prevention and suicide loss. And I remember staring out. I was on the steps of the Capitol, and I was staring out, and I thought I was really well healed. Like, I had been working and, thriving in suicide prevention. My family's going really great. And my studies were going great. Just all these good things happening in my life. And grief came up and just really bit me right there on the steps of the Capitol, and I just choked. And I started talking about Steve, and it was as if it happened yesterday. And I hadn't cried over him in years. So it's not always like that, but I've learned over time that it's always there somewhere, you know, in the back of your heart, because that person's always there in our hearts, you know, and we carry them on like, you know, like the flame of a candle, we carry them on. And sometimes things overshadow that light and all the happiness, all the good things. But every once in a while you get triggered, and it's okay, you know, when that happens. And I was in a really friendly crowd, over 1,000, you know, lost survivors who totally got it. So I just talked through my tears, and it was all good. But that moment, you know, as, you know, maybe humbling as that was, you know, or whatever, my own ideas about perfectionism or about having it all together at the time. It reminded me that, you know, we're all very human, and that grief, especially suicide loss, I think more than any other loss, we have to give ourselves, you know, grace and space to heal. And that's going to be a lifelong journey. It's going to look different as time goes by, and it's not always going to be ugly and sad tears and crying and puffy eyes. But it's okay if you cry. And it's okay if that happens 10 years later, or 20 years later, or 38 years later. You know, we really got to give ourselves permission to heal, because that's what we need, is the space to do that. And if we don't give ourselves that, then we can't be anything for anybody else.
Were you able to keep contact with his children? I mean, this is your mom's grandchildren.
Yeah. So, no, she
that, because, you know, you said that there were some problems with his new wife, which that happens a lot.
Yeah.
And it's just, it works on both sides. Everybody's upset and
everybody's
angry, and it's like, you know,
hurt. Yes, saying terrible things. And
but the children is what I was concerned
about. The children, she moved away and lost contact with all of us, but she did stay in touch with one of my nephews, and just, you know, here and there. And so, you know, I got to see pictures there of his daughter, their daughter growing up, because they were really newly married. So really, I think the person I was most wondering about was their daughter, Annie, who's now, you know, 18, 20 years old. And so she's been in touch off and on with my nephew, just kind of testing the waters. I think she's had, you know, probably her own struggle growing up, and we haven't been able to connect. You know, I wish I could say we had this really great relationship, but that hasn't happened. But I hope it does, and I'm going to still, you know, work toward that. And
you said that he had other children too from a previous relationship, marriage. What about
my sister-in-law Sue? I'm still really close with, and their kids. They're all here in Sacramento, and their kids are adults, Paul and Courtney, and they're both adults and married. And Courtney has 3 children now, but they were teenagers at the time when that happened. And so, you know, they lost their dad at a really critical time, and it was really heartbreaking. We started talking. We made a pact. I remember my little brother, my older brother, and my sister and I. We made a pact with each other that we would never ever attempt suicide. That, you know, if any of us was hurting, that we would say something, because of course we just had our brother life without saying a word to any of us. And so we made this pact when we were walking around the block, and I still remember it. Like, of course I would never do that. And I still feel that way. You know, I know statistically, I know academically, and by the studies that suicide loss puts many people at a higher risk of suicide in general. But I also know professionally and personally, very personally, that for some it's a buffer, a protective factor, that, you know, because of that very experience, they could never put that pain on anybody else by ending their life. And I know everybody might feel differently, you know, like if somebody on the panel or in this group feels differently, that's okay. But I know for me, it became a buffer over time. Like, I mean, I never could imagine killing myself anyway, but after that experience, there's no way I would do it. Like, I would go to the ends of the earth rather than, harm myself because of the tragedy of that, and there was awkwardness about who do we tell, how old, where do we draw the line about, children and, nieces and nephews, and when do we tell them, if we tell them, all those things that, families struggle with. We struggled with those as well. And, there are complications with not sharing that information and there's complications with sharing it, so I think that's the worst of good things that came out of it. But
so let's talk about,
I would trade all of them
the
if I had
good
my brother back.
And how, I mean, I would imagine at the time that your brother Steve died, you weren't thinking about doing something in crisis lines and suicide prevention and
No.
and dealing with grieving families.
No.
So how did that all come about?
Yeah, I'm an anomaly. Like if I looked back, I just wanted to help, because I remember when it happened to me, when it happened to us, I remember looking around like, where do I even turn? I remember my mom's kitchen table and the dishwasher, those wooden things that butcher block that fit on top of the dishwashers. And we had our, golden dial phone on top of the butcher block thing there. And I remember pulling out the big fat yellow pages and flipping it through, looking like, where the heck do you turn to talk to somebody about this? And I was trying to find
yellow pages under social services. You would have found us.
So I really had a hard time. I think I might have found the suicide hotline business office. I think, there might have been a listing for that. And I called about, like, maybe I could volunteer there, like, because I was really compelled. One, where do people turn about this stuff? And I had my own need. And at that time, it wasn't like I was in crisis for counseling, but I remember thinking, this is just awful. Like, where do you go? And then I thought, what are people doing about this? Because my own healing had changed over time, and I started transitioning to, no, I've got to make sure that this doesn't happen with other families. To the extent that I'm able to do that, I really wanted to make a difference. And I'm just kind of action oriented that way. And really all I wanted to do was come and volunteer 4 hours a week. And that was it. I'll give my time, I'll come in. I did Friday nights for years and volunteered on the hotline, and I was a happy camper. It was meaningful. It gave a purpose to that loss. Not that anything makes sense of that loss, but it helped me to integrate it into my future life. So I didn't, feel so stuck because it was just so foreign, and foreign to who we were as a family, foreign to me as an individual, my own, beliefs. And I wanted to make a difference. And I couldn't imagine other people going through this pain. And the more that I learned, a lot of people are going through this pain, and there's not a lot of help. At that time, there was hardly any. And there wasn't anything local other than Marilyn's group. And literally, I think that and the suicide hotline, that was it. And so I volunteered for the suicide hotline for a while. And really, I would have been happy, except it really grabbed my heart. And the more that I talked with people, the more that I, started to understand a little bit more about, just how complicated it is, all the things that lead people to that point. And that what we lived through was really common for suicide loss survivors. I wasn't alone. I remember my first, that was another grief journey. I remember my first walk. I went on a suicide prevention walk. I think it was AFSP, but it might not have been, but it was in the Bay Area. It was at the Golden Gate Bridge. And I love going to the beach. And I thought, well, maybe I'll go, do that. And I went all by myself. None of my siblings would go. Nobody in my family would go with me. And I didn't think that was too cool, by the way. But it meant something to me to go. So I put my picture of my brother on my chest, you know, on my little lanyard, and I went down there and I had a really good day in the sun and got my toes in the sand, and I walked, and I got to know a little bit more about, you know, what it is to be a loss survivor, and was blown away and cried a lot of tears, you know, just seeing people, but also seeing them also celebrate and remember and, you know, honor the lives of the people that had gone before them. And that helped me feel a little bit less alone, but I wasn't into the money making part of it. But it did help me overall feel less alone. But within my family system, I still felt like, why am I the only person that is caring about that? And then later it just, you know, God just revealed to me that that's because I'm the one that got the burden on my heart for this, right? You know, the suicide prevention piece. So I kept volunteering for several years, and then I just moved up until finally I was in the director's position. But probably, you know, my brother comes to mind frequently at work. You know, it might be somebody calling, or a similar loss survivor, you know, somebody just talking about their own story. And we don't self-disclose on the lines, but I sure can empathize in a way with somebody that lets them know, you know, that I get what it's like. And I'm really glad to be able to be in a place where we can offer services in a prevention world, which I know for me, even Marilyn and I kind of chatted about this. For me, whenever I say suicide prevention, I too struggle with that. You know, at first I thought suicide prevention, where were they for my brother? Like, you know, why didn't somebody prevent my brother's suicide? How would we have prevented my brother's suicide? The whole thing just felt really fiery and uncomfortable and dark and distant. And but then when I started seeing the numbers, I couldn't resist the opportunity to be involved. And, you know, so I started where I could, and that meant a lot to me. And that was enough for a really long time. And then opportunities just opened, and it's something I had a natural bent for. I already wanted to be a counselor when I was, you know, in college. And there were years where I put my schooling aside and I just did this work. Then several years ago, not several, well, yeah, 6 years ago, I got cancer, and uterine cancer, and that really narrowed down to a fine point, things that were really critically important to me, and things that could fall by the wayside. And one of the things that really meant a lot to me was just going back and finishing what I had started years ago, but, you know, doing it through a Christian university, and being able to help in that realm. And that's not my work here at WellSpace Health, but it also fuels a lot of what I do, you know, just my spiritual life. And that's what keeps me healthy too. But I got to finish my master's in counseling while I was sick even, and it inspired me, and it equipped me really to deal with all of that I was going through as I was learning. And there was a lot of timeouts for treatment and, you know, side effects and all those things. But I finished that 3 years ago. And I'm really, really excited and proud about that. And I probably wouldn't have pushed that far had I not dealt with such intense pain way back then. Because I never knew depression. I never knew deep, really traumatic sorrow. I never knew what, you know, PTSD was like until the loss of my brother.
So tell us a little bit about, you have been the creator and the innovator of a couple of really unusual interventions that I had never heard about before. And I don't know if anybody else in the country was doing them, if that's where you got your idea or whatever. But tell us, because I know about the one about the hospitals.
Yeah.
So, and there's, wait, tell us a little bit about that, because I think it would be helpful for all of us to kind of get a handle on what services are there out there that we didn't know about. Maybe it wouldn't have made a difference in our outcome, but
Mhm.
It's a good thing to know because we run across people that sometimes are at risk, and it's good if we know where we can suggest they can go for help
Right.
or what's
Right.
out there. So, and I know wellness also does some counseling and that sort of thing. So tell us a little bit more about the wellness programs that you've worked on and developed over the
Oh,
last few years.
WellSpace Health? Yeah, I will. So at WellSpace Health, there are a few different services that I developed over the years, and one of them was the emergency, back in 2010, was the emergency department follow-up program, and that's to help individuals who have either gone to the ER for a suicide attempt or for a suicidal crisis. And after they go through the psych response, the psych evaluation, whether they're treated and evaluated and transferred or discharged home or discharged to another facility. When they get out, most people are thinking, oh, Joe's okay now. He got help in the emergency department, right? And but oftentimes there's nothing farther from the truth. It's just an evaluation process, and they're stabilized and they're medically cleared, and then they're given resources and they go home. It's not like they go in there and get therapy. In a psychiatric inpatient facility, it's different. There they get counseling and groups and medication, all those things. And that may or may not be a helpful experience for them. But discharge from an emergency department leaves people at a higher risk of reattempt post-discharge for a week and up to a month. And so in that case, when I heard those stats from the research, I was like, well, that's awful, and that 70% of people didn't go to their follow-up appointments after discharge. And I thought, well, that's really backwards. And at the time, locally in Sacramento, they were closing down the mental health treatment center, and mental health services were really limited at best, and all kinds of things were happening. So I talked with Dr. Porteous and my supervisor at the time, and we started this, wrote a grant to SAMHSA for a small stipend for 1 year, a 1 year only stipend to implement a follow-up service. And so, our idea was doing the suicide prevention emergency department follow-up. And so we did that, and it worked really well at Sutter. And now we're doing it with Sutter, all the Sutter hospitals in the area, and all the Divinity, San Juan, and Divinity Methodist, and soon to be UC Davis as well. And we're just waiting for the final contract on that. And that's really helped a lot of people with emotional support and ongoing risk monitoring, risk assessment and monitoring, and most of all, like we give them some attempt survivor materials that can help them. We give them other links to other things besides mental health treatment, because a lot of things can lead to suicide. Sometimes it's one thing, sometimes it's just one feeling that can lead somebody, like intense aloneness or intense hopelessness. That alone can drive somebody to end their life, or it could be a whole pile of things all at the same time, and there's one triggering final event. So we try to chip away at those, in that 30-day time period, and help them feel more supported and better able to move on and avoid injuring themselves again. And we've never had anybody die in our program since 2010, which is awesome because, it's a high-risk group. And nobody was helping them. They would just kind of literally fell between the cracks, and either would attempt again, or undoubtedly some died after discharge. I don't have the numbers on those, but I do have the numbers on the people that we worked with. And
So
then the other program.
Is it only a 30-day program?
Yeah,
And
it's just a month.
So is it by phone or?
Oh yeah, it's by phone. And then we can triage them if they need counseling, and if they have Medi-Cal. WellSpace Health takes anybody that has Medi-Cal or even uninsured. Like we see people who need to be seen. And so we could bring those patients in for counseling, which is really amazing, and with a shorter wait than what the county had. So they didn't have to wait for 3 or 6 weeks. Oftentimes they could get in right away. And there were some years where I had free counseling available the next day which was amazing and unheard of in our region as far as counseling went. So that program has been doing really, really well and expanding. And then I was sitting in one of the national conferences that I go to for crisis center directors, and this psychologist his name is Bart Andrews, and Dr. Andrews was up giving the closing speech, and I remember saying, he was talking about the gap, still, shortening this widening gap of, who are we missing? Why are we not getting middle-aged white men? There's all these empty groups of people we didn't seem to be able to reach, and some of them are going to the emergency department, but that's not all of them. And there's some data about a lot of patients see their primary care doctor before they end their lives within a month. The vast majority of them have seen the primary care physician within the month before they killed themselves. And we don't know if that was all, for depression or suicidality, or if it was because they had bad headaches or, unbearable pain somewhere that they couldn't deal with. But we do know that, they oftentimes go to see their doctor for help. And I thought, well, that's a missing point. Like, that's something we could do something about. And so I wrote some notes on my napkin, and I remember thinking, I'm going to do something about this. And I went back and talked to Dr. Porteous, our CEO, about it, because we're better to start it right here than WellSpace Health. We have all these 30 some sites and health centers throughout Sacramento and Placer County, and now in Amador County. And we do screenings. We do more now, but part of that was we started doing depression screenings in all the clinics when people come in, because that's really common that people feel depressed when they go see their doctors. And I think that the number was 45% of them go to see their primary care physician within a month or less of their death. And when I talked to the doctors about that, they were like, oh, we have to do something. So I offered this 30-day follow-up, and they loved it. And it took a couple of years to really get it rolling, but it's really thriving now. And the patients love it because they get one-on-one phone support from one of my team. And we do talk with them openly about suicide if they're having ongoing thoughts, and they do. And that's the thing with both of these programs is that time post-discharge, when they got out of the hospital, they do, like 25% or more of our patients have continued thoughts of suicide even after they're discharged, but nobody was taking care of them, at that time. And that's how more people ended up attempting suicide or dying. And so I thought, well, why are we waiting for them to get to the emergency department? Why don't we get them in the health clinics instead? So we're looking at some even broader, wider ways that we could implement this. But right now it's doing really well in our WellSpace Health clinics, and the patients seem to really enjoy it. They give us a lot of positive feedback about the support that they're giving. If their risk elevates, again, we can get back in touch with the doctor that referred them or the therapist that referred them. Sometimes it's one of our LCSWs, one of those, each site has an LCSW. So that's been really helpful, and we haven't had any attempts or suicide deaths in that group of people either. So I, on a professional level, that makes me really happy and thrilled that I could be a part of creating something and implementing it and doing that in a really effective way. And on a personal note, it makes me really happy that some other families aren't going to have to suffer. I mean, professionally, that makes me happy too, but I think about it, the personal side of it too. And it's never going to make, it's not about like making a difference or making up for my brother's loss in any way. It's not like that. But if I can make a difference for other families, then that's really, really, a great thing, because nobody should have to live through that pain. And the pain of loss and the pain of being suicidal. I feel the same way about both.
So has anybody picked up this idea and this model in the other parts of the United States? Is anybody else doing this?
ED follow-up, yes. I think like 140 or 130 centers now are doing it across the nation. I know, isn't that awesome?
That is awesome.
that's a lot of people that are doing it. And, we shared our materials, and, I sat on a lot of webinars and follow-up group things with, do you remember Lee Judy? He was an LCSW with the National Lifeline and a veteran. I think he works with the VA now, but anyway, he was part of the follow-up specialty programs. And so we helped to guide and, equip other centers who wanted to start their follow-ups. There was one or two that tried the ED follow-up before we did, but it was really short-lived. And there's one back east, and then there was one in the Bay Area in Contra Costa County, and it only lasted 6 months, and the hospital canceled it out for no reason, and that was it. But since then, yeah, many centers have been doing ED follow-up and doing a really good job of it, and that really excites me. Primary care follow-up, no, we're the only one, and I hope to be able to share this on one of our conferences, just because I think it's such a great concept, and it's really effective, and it's really making a big difference on a human level. And I know that those individuals, not only are they feeling better, but their loved ones are being spared a lot of pain by them still being alive and still being, healthy and happy and well.
And so at this point, let's take a stop for a minute. Check with Susan.
Yes, I have a couple of questions.
You have some questions, Susan?
Yes. The first question is, as a Christian counselor, how do you explain God's presence or absence when someone dies by suicide? How do you comfort survivors?
Yeah. I go with people's comfort levels. I feel really strongly, just on the spiritual note, this is outside of WellSpace Health. The Bible doesn't say anything that condemns somebody for suicide, but I wouldn't tell that to somebody who is suicidal. I wouldn't give them, permission. If the reason for staying alive is they don't want to go to hell, then I wouldn't want to go to hell either. And I'm gonna let them go with that thought. But I do believe, that God's there with us in the midst of the pain, and even in our darkest moments, we are not alone. And he knew sorrow far deeper than anything we've experienced, right? He knew sorrow, deep pain. He cried, he wept, he knows what all that's about. And so for those who share that belief, I've heard many people say, they could feel his presence. But then on the flip side, there are a lot of times where depression can get in the way of your spiritual practices. And maybe you've been going to church all your life, and or you go to a Bible study or something, or synagogue, and then you get depressed maybe after a suicide loss, and you can't feel God anymore, and you feel like he's not answering your prayers. And why did God let all those questions, all those what do they call those questions? But why did God let this happen? And none of us really have clear answers about that. We won't. We wish we did, and that would somehow make sense of it all, but it really wouldn't. The person with the answers is gone, and the people who leave notes behind them, that rarely makes sense. And the only one who really has those answers is God. And so for me, when I'm talking with individuals, I'll share a little bit about that. And then too, that, one day when we get up there, we'll be able to ask God ourselves, right? What? And maybe then we won't even care, right? We'll be just happy, and we'll be in heaven, and it just won't matter, and we'll see them again. And that's my own personal belief. That doesn't have the WellSpace Health sticker on it, but that's my personal answer to your spiritual question.
I like that. I have a second question from one of our attendees tonight. She writes, a great deal of research that I have read has shown that many people who die by suicide don't give any signs that they are suicidal. How does the model you are discussing, for example, risk assessment, etc., account for individuals who are not displaying overt signs or open about their thought processes? What are some options to intervene and help those individuals? So before you answer, that's a really tough question, because I don't know if I shared with this person, but, and I know Marilyn and I, my cousin who took his own life, there was, we were clueless. There was no sign. He was happy. He was doing his day to day.
Yep.
You know, there was absolutely no indication other than when I gave him a big hug, he just felt kind of skinny. And I said, what are you burning the candle both ends? And he looked tired. But other than that, everything else was perfectly normal. So go ahead, Liseanne.
Well, and that's the challenge of it is look, in hindsight, you probably see that, Susan. You probably think, oh yeah, looking back, oh, he was kind of skinny and he didn't look like himself and he looked a little tired, right? And we know, like I know now, that some of those things are signs of depression, could be, right? And we're not going to diagnose them just based on those things, but saying goodbyes. My brother didn't officially say goodbye, but looking hindsight, I could see that that's what that was. But for those who aren't saying, I want to kill myself, for those who are not really visibly depressed and crying and outwardly sad or talking openly about ending their life, or even vaguely, like vague comments about suicide, sometimes people dismiss those. But there are people who don't. And there are people who just carry that pain inside of them and don't share it, up until their death. And that's I think that's the hardest group for me to even think about. It's the hardest group to reach. And so we try with messaging, we try reaching people by, whether it's a social media post or, newspaper articles or magazine ads, things that people would just read, in the buy and buy, little wallet cards, literature that the doctors get, to get the word out about depression and suicide, and that, help is available, in hopes that we reach those people who aren't talking about it. And maybe they're not talking about it because they don't realize how bad it is. And maybe they're not talking about it because they're afraid of what's going to happen if they do, which is an understandable concern. And, you don't get locked up for just feeling suicidal. People talk about it with their doctors and their therapists a lot, but, you can do that without going, being carted off and locked up. But there is a group of people who just don't talk about it. And, I would say that my brother was one of those, at the time when we experienced his death. None of us saw that coming. He had everything he was 50, he had lots of money, he had a beautiful home, a beautiful wife. I would say all the same things. He was thriving and happily remarried, and baby on the way. Who can even imagine ending your life with a baby on the way, right? And none of it made sense at all. And it still doesn't. So I think I do think there's always going to be a group of people that just never talk about it. So we can keep trying, keep trying to get the word out, and keep trying to share the message of hope, and that help is available, and try to find new ways to get help earlier, before waiting until the very last moment of crisis. But there may always be people that we can't reach.
I had the same experience. My son, we had absolutely no signs at all. But I had to kind of come to the conclusion that we can't help somebody or reach out to someone unless they let us know what they're thinking or what's going on in their heads. And if they don't share that, then we can't read their mind.
Responsibility. And
also, I sort of had to say, he was 18, he was legally an adult. He should have, it was his responsibility to say something. But I also think sometimes they don't let you know, because they don't want you to stop them. And they're determined what they're going to do. They've made the decision, and they're mostly men, and they make their decision, and that's what they've decided to do. To solve whatever issue, whatever problem, whatever circumstance, whatever it is. And so that's why they don't let us know.
Yeah.
And I guess they've thought about it so much that they've reached the point of lost hope, and they're desperate, and they've got a loss of hope, and they just don't think there is any other answer.
That's true.
But there's nothing we can do if we don't know somebody needs help. I tell people, operate on your gut. Now, if you think something's sort of wrong, even though you really don't have good signs or anything, but if you got a gut feeling, check it out.
check it out and ask. You're not going to offend them. If they are suicidal, you're not going to offend them. And if they're not suicidal, they're just going to go, no, what are you talking about, mom? Or, dad, or whoever,
They
whatever
might
the
say that
relationship is.
anyway, though.
Yes, they could. They really could. And, on the other side, Marilyn, in my world, it's suicide prevention. I know there are a lot of people like, Kevin Hines is a big advocate nationally, and he talks about surviving a jump off of the Golden Gate Bridge, which very few people do. And he said at the minute his hand left the edge, the rails, he thought, oh God, what did I do? And he regretted it. He was ambivalent his whole way up to the bridge. If somebody would have stopped him, he said he wouldn't have done it. And then finally some woman stops and asks him to take her picture. And he just thought it was, a sick sign from above that he needed to be gone because he was so depressed. He had bipolar disorder and he was in a really bad crisis. There are a lot of people even that call the suicide hotline. Only 0.5% of our calls end up in a 911 intervention. We talk to people who are thinking about suicide a lot. More than half of our calls are about suicide. A lot of them are high to imminent risk calls, but we de-escalate it and they feel better after talking about it. And a lot of our calls are third-party calls. We have loved ones that are saying, oh, my friend, son, brother, neighbor is suicidal. What do I do? And we help them through that. So that's one way we can help the community and help any of your loved ones.
Oh, do you have any more questions, Susan? I want to cut you off because we've got about 7 minutes left, and
no, I don't have any more questions. I've asked for questions, so no more questions.
Oh, okay, because I didn't want you sitting there and thinking I got to call a few more questions.
I was gladly waving my hands.
Well, the thing I was going to say is, there are people that call sometimes, and they've even already done something to end their life. And just when I think, oh, people who call the hotline don't really want to die. And I guess on some small note, that could be true. Because even you're calling suicide prevention, I remind myself who called who. When it feels like a scary situation, I can always remind myself that they did call suicide prevention and not the morgue. And but there's some times where it's really a scary situation, but people oftentimes don't want to die alone. And so, for those who might come across somebody and you're wondering, I guess is what I'd say before we wind up is, if somebody's showing big changes in behavior, big changes in mood, they're withdrawing, they're just not themselves. If they start talking about feeling really hopeless or just not going on, just wanting to go to sleep and disappear, those kind of vague general signs, don't be afraid to ask. And you might be the person who asked and who talked about it. I know who I'm talking with, and I don't want anybody to feel guilt or doubt or anything like that, but do speak up and encourage others to. If you see signs, if your gut tells you, like Marilyn's saying, if your gut's telling you something's wrong, ask and don't give up until you feel like you know what's going on. And then, worst case scenario, you want to know you've done everything you can so that, if that person ends their life, at least you're going to know that you've done whatever you can to protect them and to prevent it. Hopefully be able to save a life in doing that.
Mm-hmm. So I wanted to wind this up and tell us about your life now, because I want to know about the triplets. The triplets or quads? No, wait a minute.
I have a surprise for you. This is such a happy way to end my conversation.
Yeah, there's a lot of things to celebrate too, in spite of the loss we've had. It isn't just the loss that it shouldn't eat up the rest of your life.
Absolutely. And it hasn't. It did indeed, consume a lot of my time and emotion for a couple of years, and then some. But one thing I'm super excited about is my youngest daughter, Mary, my youngest daughter, Emily, who is 30, had triplets. They're going to turn 9 on the 11th of this month. So they're almost 9, but this is what they looked like when they were first born, Keaton, Colton, and Kylie. And they're just adorable triplets. So I'm really sad that my brother didn't get to see them, and others in my family as well. But we have triplets, and my daughter's an unexpected single mom of triplets. So she and the triplets live with me, and that's lots of fun and insanity and fun and giggles and mess. And then we just found out too, crazy world, that my older daughter, Mary, who's 33 and has been married for, I want 10. They've been trying for about a year and a half, and they just got pregnant, and she's having a baby, and it's twins. So we're having twins. They live in Santa Cruz, and so we're getting her ready to have twins in December. And
but you don't have to help raise them.
Thank the good Lord, they're not going to all be living in my house too. It's a lot of joy, and you know, I gotta say, and you know, all of those moments of joy, they do have a little, you know, twinge of sadness too, because there are things that I really wish that my brother had lived on to enjoy and see and experience, and
with his own children.
Somehow I know he's just gonna know all about that, and I still incorporate him. You know, I still include him in my life. I talk about my brother to my grandkids. I haven't shared, you know, how he passed, and they're just little babes. But you know, I talk about my brother, and we talk about death. We talk about feelings a lot in my family. And they're just going to be kids that grow up talking about their feelings, and I'm hoping that makes a difference, but it might not, but I hope that it does.
Yeah.
But meanwhile, thanks for sharing the happy side of, you know, it does get better over time, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you.
Oh, because you know, every time I see you, I want to know about the triplets.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Pictures we've seen over the years and everything. It's hard to believe they're 9 years old.
9, I know.
We got online.
But we have not aged.
Of course not.
I have another question from Scott. He said, can I get information from Dr. Liseanne on the follow-up program to present to our local health system?
Yes. What local health system would that be?
I'm not sure, but I could, why don't I connect the two of you?
Yeah.
I can email you both, and then you can chat.
Yeah, give him my work email, and sorry, my nose is just, that'd be great, and I'd love to talk with him about it.
Okay, Scott, I will connect the two of you together. And then Cheryl had asked, this is a tough question. When the person is under the influence, how can we know if they intended suicide?
Oh, yeah.
That's a tough question.
Well, yeah, and many emergency room doctor would like to know that as well, right? And I will say this. Alcohol and drugs remove our inhibitions. Alcohol is a depressant. It makes us more depressed. It makes you more impulsive. So you're more likely to act on thoughts that you're having, like suicidal thoughts. Also violence, you know, like people who get drunk, oftentimes, not all, but, you know, are more violent than they normally are. That also includes violence towards self. It also includes domestic violence. All those things go up when people are intoxicated. And their inhibitions are down, so they're not afraid of doing things that normally there would be like a social norm that you don't do those things. And that includes a lot of just bad social behavior, but it also includes really serious things like suicide. And so a couple things on that, you know, they have to look at, does this person have a pattern of alcohol abuse? Or do they have an addiction? Do they have a substance use addiction happening? Do they have a history of mental illness or depression? Are there any signs that point towards suicide? And, you know, just like with the coroner has to kind of look objectively at deaths that are like, let's say, an overdose. And they do a forensic interview or forensic examination and look to see, was it accidental or intentional? And sometimes they know that, and sometimes they don't. And if they don't know really clearly, then they'll go on the side of overdose or, you know, unexplained, or rather than suicide, because they won't call it a suicide unless they really have some compelling evidence that it's suicide, whether that's a death or an attempt in the hospital. Does that answer your question?
I think that answers.
Yeah, there are a lot of suicidal individuals that get drunk, and also people ignore it. yeah, that get drunk and talk about suicide, and people think, oh, he's drunk, he doesn't mean it. He is thinking about suicide. You know, if somebody's intoxicated and they're talking about killing themselves, they are thinking about suicide. So it's not just the alcohol, because a lot of times later they'll say, oh, I was just drunk. You know, you got that information out of somewhere, right? You just didn't pull the rabbit out of the hat.
Right.
So there's that element of it too, as far as
So
intoxication goes.
we're 2 minutes over according to my computer. So thank you so much, Liseanne. I was so glad that you were willing to be our webinar
Thank
speaker
you.
this month. And it being Suicide Prevention Month and week coming up and everything.
Yeah.
And I hopefully that everything you shared would be kind of not only inspiring to people and they can relate to your journey of loss, but also to know that sometimes it causes us to do things that we hadn't planned on doing in life, and it's all to the good. It's all to the good, and we accomplish a great deal. And so we know about WellSpace, and for some people that are looking for counseling or want to call the crisis line, please feel free to do that.
Yep.
They've got volunteers 24/7 that are manning the phones.
Yep.
And any last word, Liseanne? Thank you so much. We're delighted to have you, and it's good to see you.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you so much. You too, and thank you all. I hope you have a really great evening.
Thank you so much. Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you for coming.
Good night.
Good night.